All right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'll try to do my best to live up to the expectations. I hope that there will be time at the end to have a bit of a question and answer session. I think it's always difficult to try to make a presentation with more than 70 people in the room because it's difficult for me to know who is who and who expects what. But my presentation will be about half an hour, and then I think we can enter into a question and answer session. Let me first speak a little bit about the definition of homelessness. It might be a boring issue, but it's really, really important also for transnational work on homelessness, so that at least we know what we're speaking about. FEANTSA has worked years, but probably about 10 years, to find an agreement within our own network, which is a network, and I'll come back to that in later at the end of the presentation, is a network, or originally was a network of homeless service providers. And we spent years discussing the actual definition of homelessness. And we agreed after a while of discussion and called the definition ETHOS, the European Typology of Homelessness and Housing Exclusion. And there is actually two versions of the typology. One is a full typology, and then there is a typology which we call ETHOS Light, which is a reduction of the full ETHOS, which is mostly used for data collection purposes. It's what people would call literal homeless. So let me try to explain a little bit what ETHOS is. We see homelessness in 4 different categories, and I'll explain a little bit every category. The first category is the roofless category. This is people that live on the street or live part of the day or night on the street. So people staying in night shelters, night-only shelters, we call them roofless as well, because they're forced to stay part of the 24 hours of a day onto the street. Then you have the houseless category, which brings together, you could say, all the temporary housing solutions like homeless shelters, short stay shelter, longer stay shelters, etc. And then we have 2 other categories which are probably a little bit controversial, but I'll explain you why we have included them. It's the category of inadequate housing. So the very inadequate housing, if you live in that kind of housing, we think that your experience amounts to the experience of homelessness. And here we have situations like people living in mobile homes, people living in temporary structures, etc. And then we have the very insecure housing, the insecure housing dimension, and this is the people forced to stay with family and friends because of lack of housing of their own, the so-called sofa surfers, people that are in institutions like prison or mental health care and about to be released, but who have no place to go anywhere, etc. So all of that together is what we call homelessness, the broad definition of homelessness. You can find the actual ETHOS and ETHOS Light definitions on our website with all the details, the broader categories, the operational categories, etc. But what is important is that ETHOS should not be read as a hierarchy of the seriousness of the situation. We don't want to say that roofless is necessarily a worse situation than houseless, which is necessarily a worse situation than very inadequate housing, which is necessarily a worse situation than insecure housing. I can think of situations where inadequate housing is much worse than houseless, for instance. So I think it's careful to read it. It's important not to read it in that way.
Freek?
And all, yes, sorry.
Sorry, it's Liat. Our interpreters ask if you could speak a little bit slower, because they're trying to interpret it to the different language. So if you could just be a bit slower, that's
okay. Yes.
Thank you.
I'll try, Liat. It's not one of my strongest assets to speak slow, but I'll do an effort. And if I move again to speaking quick, tell me so that I can slow down again. It's the fault of my wife, because she speaks so fast that I have to speak fast as well if I want to get anything through. So back to ETHOS, the definition. What we want to do as well is to capture the reality of the most extreme form of exclusion in all EU member states. And if you limit yourself to the roofless and houseless categories, you basically have what we call a service paradox. Those countries that invest a lot of resources in all kinds of temporary accommodation for homeless people in all types of shelters, they will have more homeless people than or countries that don't do that, where homelessness is more hidden in the inadequate and insecure housing categories. And this was especially visible or especially problematic after the enlargement of the European Union. If we want to capture the reality of homelessness, the reality of extreme exclusion, we thought it was important to have a broader definition of homelessness. So the 4 categories: roofless, houseless, inadequate housing, and insecure housing. And it's also be seen as a dynamic process. Like, people are not stuck in one category for years or for the rest of their life. They move from one to the other category and sometimes back to a former category. Like to capture that dynamic process that homelessness is, it's important to have a relatively broad definition. Now, many like ETHOS was developed more than 10 years ago, I think even 15 years ago now. And since then, it has been picked up by different actors. First of all, it has been picked up by academia. You will see many references to ETHOS in academic articles. And it's used as a reference definition. So to make clear to the readers what homelessness, the research is all about. But it's not only an academic decision, academic definition. It has now also been picked up by policymakers at local, at national level, by services, etc. So it's quite frequently used also outside of the European Union. And even the European Commission uses it now more and more for their own policy work and data collection work. To give you one example, very recently, Eurostat did a survey, an ad hoc model in the EU Silk survey, where they questioned people about their past experience of homelessness. So they asked people, have you been homeless in your life? And they used the FEANTSA ETHOS Light definition to ask these questions. You can find the results. It's a quite interesting process, the results of this survey on the Eurostat website. So I think if you have not heard of ETHOS yet, it's useful to look at it. And it's like, if you want to use it as a reference definition, you would certainly not be the only ones. So here you see the actual ETHOS Light, which is what we have developed for data collection purposes, which is more the sort of what people think is literal homeless. So you have there the roofless, houseless, but also people in non-conventional dwellings, and also the sofa surfers. And there seems to be a consensus growing that at least that is should be considered as homelessness. Now, 2 words about data on homelessness. It's the single most frequent question we get: how many people are homeless in the European Union? And it's an extremely difficult question to answer. But the 700,000 figure is out there in the public sphere. It's being cited in increasing number of policy documents, but also in the media. So it's important probably to explain to you where the number comes from. It's an estimation that we have done as FEANTSA on the basis of existing public or public data, or data that have been provided by NGOs but are certified by public authorities in all where they exist in the EU member states, and then we have extrapolated that to capture also the countries where there is no official data. So I'm not saying it is a very robust estimation in terms of methodology, but I think it's still quite close to the truth, to the reality. So we in FEANTSA, we believe that there is at least 700,000 people that live on the street or in a shelter, a homeless shelter, on any given night in the European Union. So you see that that's only capturing a part of the ETHOS definition, even less than the ETHOS Light. But it's because of the lack of data on some of the other categories that we decided to focus on those two for a European estimate. Of course, that's on any given night. You all know that homeless people tend to move from one situation into the other, from the street into a shelter, from a shelter into a sofa surfer, and then back into a shelter, etc. And some people move out of homelessness, of course. So it's important to make a difference between point-in-time figure, like how many people are homeless now, today, or this week, and how many people experience homelessness over the time of a year. And if you take that last figure, we estimate that there is at least 4 million people that experience at least one day on the street or in a shelter over the period of a year. So that's the estimates that we have so far. What is important, maybe more important than the actual total number, is the fact that it has been growing and growing rapidly in the last decade in almost all EU member states. It has been, like in some countries, has been more or less stable or growing slowly, but in quite a few countries, actually quite a lot. If you take the growth rate for the European Union as a whole, we could argue that there is a 70% increase in 10 years. So we did the same estimate 10 years ago. And if we compare both, we see an increase of 70%, so 70%. And that's really like sometimes it's not possible anymore to shock people with figures. But if you compare that to the at-risk of poverty rate at European Union level, over the same period, that has remained more or less stable. The aggregate for the European Union. So you see that there is something really seriously, really concerning happening at the bottom end of society when that concerns homelessness. The notable exception in the European Union to that trend is Finland, where homelessness has consistently gone down in the last 10 to 15 years. And I'll come back and say a few words about Finland in a minute. Apart from the data, the numbers, the total number, important is, of course, the profile of the homeless population. And the profile is still, or the homeless population is still dominated, or is still predominantly single man of middle age. But we see rapidly growing rates of youth homelessness, growing rates of family homelessness in quite a number of countries, quite concerning, probably related to the dysfunctional housing market, and also the impact of migration. You know, the flaws in migration policies spill over into homelessness. And when I started in FEANTSA, homeless migrants was an issue for the south of Europe. Now it's not anymore an issue of the south of Europe. Countries like Germany, Sweden, etc., also have this issue, probably related to the migration crisis. I see that there is a bit of sun. Migration crisis of 2015-16. In Eastern Europe, it's still not such a big issue, migration and homelessness, although in some countries it's growing. And then I think it's important to say something about the time dimension. It's something that is often forgotten when we speak about data, because homeless people are not homeless forever. There is people that are chronically homeless, which means that are consistently homeless for longer than 1 year. But there is also people that are episodically homeless, so people that come back into the homeless system from time to time. And then there is people that are transitional homeless. They enter into the homeless system, but then they leave and never come back. And if it's very difficult because it's a bit different from country to country in the European Union. But you could say that the chronically homeless people, so the people that are homeless more than 1 year, is a minority of the total homeless population. And the biggest part of the homeless population is the transitional homeless. Now, I don't have the aggregated figures for the EU, but if you look at the US, 10% of the homeless population is chronic, 10% is episodical, and 80% is actually transitional. Now, that probably has to do with the weak social welfare system in the US. So it might be a bit different for the European Union as a whole. But I think the focus is very often on chronic homelessness, while actually the majority also in the European Union are episodical and transitional homeless. And then in terms of beds, our estimate is that more than 600,000 beds are available in all types of shelters, short stay shelter, middle stay shelter, long stay shelter, integration shelter, etc. So that's what I can say about data. Happy to answer questions later on. That's a map from a few years ago already, but it shows that the situation is dire in most European countries, except in Finland and Norway. Norway is outside of the European Union, but it's also important to say that Norway is doing actually quite well on homelessness since a couple of years. Now, on data collection, I think you could argue in general that those countries that have solid data collection systems have better policies in place. And that's, of course, logical, because if you understand the issue better through data collection, you will have more, you will have the ability to adapt your policy more to the needs of the homeless population and the changing trends. But it's very difficult to have to capture the whole ethos definition in a consistent way over time. We don't underestimate the difficulty, but it is possible. Look at countries like Denmark, for instance. They are really setting the example when it comes to data collection. But the different sources for data collection are, and you probably know it already, it's administrative data. In many countries, you need to be assessed by a local authority as homeless before you get the right to support. That assessment provides data, and so local authorities collect data that way. There is other ways that administrative data are made available. There is also NGO data. So NGOs are an important source of data. Many shelters collect data, some more detailed data than others on homeless. Then there is many countries and local authorities that do specific counts, street counts, for instance, often with volunteers. And then you have alternative sources of data on homelessness, health data, for instance. There is countries where the coroners, for instance, when they provide a death certificate, identify if the person was homeless or not. And that's also quite interesting. The data is just an example, of course, data from the justice system, etc. And if you want to try to capture as much as possible from the large ethos definition, I think all countries will have to have a combination of these data. But as I said, it's important not to get overly obsessed by the total number, because that's always a figure that will be criticized. It's important to also look at trends and profile data, because they're more informative for policy. It's important to know, for instance, if families or women's homelessness is increasing versus other types of homelessness, rather than to know if the total number is going up or down. That was what I wanted to say about data and data collection. Now a few words about policy. And sorry to be probably a little bit superficial, but it's the time constraints, of course, that leave me no choice. But I think it's important to understand that there is different approaches possible to homelessness, and that they're often concurring. For us, it's not so easy to say that country or that city is doing well and that city is not doing well at all, because often you have the bad approaches and the good approaches present in the same place. But I just put them here separately. One of the things that concerns us quite a bit in the last couple of years, especially, is the increasing criminalization and penalization of street homelessness. It happens in many countries. In some countries in a bit of a stealth way, in other countries in a bit of a more overt way. Hungary is the clear example where actually the constitution has been changed to allow local authorities to criminalize street homelessness. But I don't think we have to get obsessed or overly focused on Hungary. Criminalization and penalization of homelessness is an issue in many countries, and it seems to be increasing. And I don't think it's always of a result of malicious intent, you know, from policymakers. It might be the lack of understanding what homelessness is all about and how you address it more effectively. So it might be sort of an instrument of last resort because people or responsible policymakers don't know what to do else. But it is a problem that is on the increase. Then you have what we call the so-called staircase model, where you want to make homeless people housing ready. So you transition them through the shelter system and you prepare them to be housing ready. And when they're housing ready, you move them into social housing or other forms of supported housing. And during the time that people are in the shelter system, they sort of address their mental health problem, their addiction problems, their relational problems, their financial problems, all the problems that they might have, and they move in the shelter system up if they make progress on these in these areas, from short stay shelter to longer stay shelter, etc. There is many countries have that still in place, and my country as well, Belgium. There is still quite a bit of staircase. I put Germany here as an example because I'm surprised how slow housing first is getting attention, how little attention still, how slow it's getting off the ground in Germany. So there is really predominantly the staircase model, but it is an issue in many countries, obviously. And then there is housing first. And I'm coming back to that, so I'm not going to say anything about it. You're familiar with housing first, but the example of housing first, where housing first approaches to homelessness exist already 15 years, I think, if not longer, is Finland. And it's interesting to look a little bit, to zoom into Finland, and I'll do that in a minute. And then there is prevention. And I think that's an area that is really underdeveloped, especially targeted prevention. Like, of course, there's lots of things that prevent homelessness in the end, like a good welfare system might prevent homelessness. But I'm talking about a targeted prevention, like preventing homelessness after institutional release, eviction prevention, etc. I think there is more that can be done specifically in relation to the prevention of homelessness. So, and like I said, these strategies often concur and have to concur. Like you have to, if you do housing first, well, you have to do it together with prevention, obviously. What is important to mention here as well is that a lot of this is done at local level. In almost all countries, if not all EU member states, the local authorities are the driving force when it comes to addressing homelessness. But what we see is that local authorities are more effective when they can take up their role within a solid, explicit, visible, national or regional homeless policy framework. I'll come back to that in a minute as well. Some inconvenient truths, and I say it with prudence, but I think it's important to say it. There is the assumption that if you have a solid and good social welfare system, that you necessarily have less homeless people. I think it's a bit more complex than that. We have seen, like, for instance, massive increases in homelessness. Homelessness doubled in the Netherlands in the last, 6-7 years, and Netherlands is a country with a very robust, well-functioning social welfare system, and still it produces homelessness. So I think what I'm trying to say is that we shouldn't be complacent about homelessness in countries where there is a solid welfare system, social welfare system. You need something more. And the same can be said about inequality. if you would rank all the countries on the basis of their level of inequality, and then rank the countries on the basis of the level of on the basis of the number of homeless people, you will see different rankings. One of the most equal countries in Europe is the Czech Republic, but it's also one of the countries with highest prevalence of homelessness, at least according to recent OECD numbers. So also there, let's not be complacent about homelessness in countries where inequality is low. And the same can be said about social housing. It's not because you have a lot of social housing that you have necessarily less homeless people. You need more than just a lot of social housing. And again, here the Netherlands would be a good example. The Netherlands is the country with the highest stock of social housing. 30% of the entire stock, housing stock, is social housing, and still it didn't manage to stop a doubling of homelessness, like I said. And it has actually quite a high prevalence. I think the Netherlands has now almost 40,000 people that experience homelessness over a year. What I think, I'm of course not arguing against solid welfare systems and less inequality and more social housing. We all want that. But the defining factor, if you have that, to make success, I mean, to be successful in homelessness, is to have a distinct and effective homeless strategy at national as well as at local level. That's really important, I think. Now, a few words about housing first, and I'm sorry if I repeat what you already know. I think that's unavoidable to some extent. But let's go through the basics again. Housing first is using housing as a tool for integration rather than a reward at the end of an integration process. So you could say the staircase model is rewarding people that integrate well in the shelter system with housing at the end of the integration process. It's almost like a present at the end of the integration process. Housing first put housing, access to stable, permanent housing in the beginning. So it's immediate access to housing, and it also separates the housing and the support. I think that's important because, of course, also in the staircase model, people move out of homelessness. I'm not saying that, and into supported housing, but often the acceptance of support is a condition to get into the housing. That is not true in housing first. So the support, the social support, addiction support, mental health support, etc., is available, but it's not in a condition for a homeless person to get the house and to keep the housing. There is other principles that are underpinning housing first, but I think the immediate access to housing and the separation of housing and support, I think, are probably the most important one. Initially, we shouldn't forget that we have stolen the ID, the housing first ID, from the US. It was developed in the mid of the 90s in New York, and initially, and certainly still in the US, it aims at the chronic homeless people. But I think in Europe, we're more creative. We probably also can allow ourselves to be a little bit more creative because of the welfare systems that are a little bit more solid. But we're trying to also do housing first for new target groups like young people, women fleeing domestic violence, etc. There's some really interesting experiments with these target groups. But the reason why in the US they focus on chronic homeless people is because the chronicity of homelessness is a proxy of the complexity of their problems. And actually, they want to offer housing first to homeless people with very complex problems. And using chronicity is an easy way to select them. Like if you're longer than a year homeless, you are a potential candidate for housing first. Now, in some countries in Europe, like in Denmark, they have looked at how chronicity and complexity relate to each other. And they have found that episodical, transitional, and chronic homeless people have actually very complex needs. And so you could say in these countries that housing first can be made available for all these groups, even if they're not chronically homeless. So I think it's important to look in your city or in your country how chronicity and complexity relate. And if the entire homeless population has very complex needs, you can actually scale or broaden the target group of housing first beyond the chronically homeless. Now, in terms of results, there is lots of experiments in Europe, experimentations in Europe as well as outside Europe. And what we see from all these experiments, some are really big and some are really accompanied with robust scientific evaluation. What we see is that in all of these experiments, and even in countries where it has been brought to scale, the housing retention rate is more than 80%. So 80% of the homeless that are offered housing first stay in the housing. And in some countries it's much higher. I think in Denmark it's more than 90%. I think in Belgium it's also more than 90%. So it can be much higher, but it's at least 80%. And if you compare that to the staircase model where we have data, it's often not higher than 50% that keep the housing after the integration process through the shelter system. Another important factor is that people feel much better in housing first. So the subjective well-being goes up. It's what academics call the ontological security. They feel more secure, they feel happier, they feel more comfortable, etc. Even if the objective health indicators don't necessarily show that, it's important. Like the subjective well-being is an important outcome. The results in terms of health and addiction are a little bit mixed. I think it's also because we don't have sufficient data yet to make a judgment. There is positive outcomes, more negative outcomes, or stability. So we'll have to wait a little bit longer. And it tends to be cost effective, especially for the most complex homeless people, which, if they stay homeless, are quite expensive because they make use of a lot of expensive public services like shelter, but also prison, mental health care, hospital care, etc. So I think you have to be a bit careful with the cost effectiveness argument, because if you move away from the worst cases, the cost effectiveness argument probably doesn't hold entirely anymore. Now, if you look at housing first in Europe, there is a lot of talking about housing first, but I said earlier on, there is about 600,000 beds in homeless shelter. If you compare that to the beds in housing first, we're probably talking about 10,000s. So we're not at the tipping point yet, absolutely not. And the differences are huge between countries. There is still some countries where it's absolutely inexistent. I give the example here of the Baltic states. There is some countries where there is isolated experiments, like people of goodwill interested in housing first do a small local experiment. You see them in Germany, you see them in Austria, also in other countries. I just cite them here as examples. Then you have the countries where there is more organized experimentation, where there's a role for public authorities and where they try to bring the learning from all these experiments together with the ambition to turn it into actual mainstream policy. And that you see in countries like UK and Spain, for instance. And then there are the countries where housing first is actually being scaled now, brought to scale at local level. France is an interesting example where I think now a few dozen cities with the support of the national government are doing housing first. Denmark would be a good example as well. And then there are the countries where it has become the main policy intervention, like Finland and Norway. Now, I think that we have to try to overcome this idea that every country has to start with its own experiment before investing in scaling and making it a mainstream policy intervention, because there is so much evidence that it works that it's a bit of a waste of time to see if it works in your country or in your city as well. Now, there are some challenges with housing first and bringing housing first to scale. One is the divide between, or the difference between seeing housing first as a project and seeing housing first as a way to transition or transform the way homelessness is addressed. We call it systemic housing first. Like if you want to do systemic housing first, it means that you have this ambition to make it a mainstream policy intervention. If you just keep it as a project, you can have many projects popping up, but they are added to what exists already. They don't transition or transform what exists already. If you do systemic housing first, after a while, you should see a decrease in the shelter system, in the number of beds in the shelter system. In Finland, for instance, there is almost no beds in shelter anymore. So I think it's important to focus on the systemic housing first, rather than promote the housing first as a project. And if you start with an experiment, it's more likely that you get stuck in the sort of housing first as a project. I think there is also a lot of debate on the balance between being having high fidelity to the original approach as it was developed in the United States, and pragmatism. You know, housing first as a project puts a lot of emphasis on the fidelity. If you want to do systemic housing first, you have to be a little bit more pragmatic with the different principles underpinning housing first. Not to violate them, but a bit of pragmatism. And then there is a big issue in relation to the access to funding, to have the transition from the staircase model to the housing first model. I would be lying if I said that that is not a costly process. It is a costly process. You will need more money for a while before the cost-benefit argument is at play, you know, and that money is often not there at local level, and it should be stated more often that there is also a financial issue. It's not about, I want to do housing first, you also have to have the means to do housing first. You cannot close for every bed in housing first, you cannot close a bed in shelter. It doesn't work like that. So you have to allow the both systems to exist next to each other for a while, and that's a costly transition process.
Freek?
Yes, I have to stop.
1 o'clock, so I know you still have a few slides left. Maybe
okay, very
5
quickly.
more minutes?
Yeah. Yes, well, we have a housing first guide that we developed, so you can look into that. Maybe very quickly, still here on the policy dynamics, because I think you will see them at local level quite clearly. There seems to be first a focus on quantity of shelter beds, so you want to have enough shelter beds. When that's realized, you focus on the quality of the shelter beds. So the physical quality, you adapt the beds to the target group, you make sure that the shelter beds are adapted to the stage in the integration process, etc. And if you do that for years, you inevitably end up with a growing and unsustainable shelter system with lots of different shelters, but an illusion of progress. People move from one shelter to the other. There is the illusion of progress, but the outflow is very low. And that's incredibly costly. In a country like France, they estimate that the shelter sector costs 2 billion euro, if I'm not mistaken. So that's something. And then when you are in that system, the willingness to do housing first and make the paradigm shift is easier. But what I want to say is you don't have to go through that process to do housing first, because that's a waste of time. I'm not going into detail. You can ask me about that. But Finland is an interesting case because they do housing first, but there is other things at play as well. They took the time to realize impact, 15 to 20 years. They cut the problem in pieces, didn't want to solve everything at the same time. There is a political consensus in Finland about housing first and that it works, which is not the case in many other countries. That helps. They try to focus on the 80% for whom it works rather than the 20% for whom it doesn't work. And there's many countries that are obsessed with the exception rather than the rule. Try to do like the Finns and focus on the rule rather than the exception. And here, maybe I can leave that for later, but there is, of course, some EU relevance and unprecedented opportunities the years ahead in terms of access to funding, but also in terms of policy support from the European Union. Tomorrow, the European Union, the Commission will announce that it will launch an EU collaboration platform on homelessness, in which they want to work with member states and local authorities and support them to do better on the issue of homelessness. So it's something to watch, and I'm willing to share more information in the discussion. And the last thing I want to say is on FEANTSA, because I think it's important for you to understand that FEANTSA has evolved over time. It started off as a trade union of the shelter sector, turned into a knowledge and expert platform on homelessness, and is now actually trying to become a multi-stakeholder movement that can tap into the knowledge that we have developed over time. And that means that we are not just NGOs anymore as members of FEANTSA. We now open up to membership from local authorities, public agencies, ministries, etc. Non-NGOs, you could say. And for us, it's important to capture as many of the stakeholders that are involved in providing a solution to homelessness. So this is an invitation for you to consider membership of FEANTSA. So a little bit of promotion there. Voilà, I think that's it. So there is a bit of time now for questions and answers, I hope.
Yes, thank you so much, Freek. We still have time for questions if you want. We will leave the room open as well for those of you who want to stay and talk about it. So in the chat, there are mainly remarks and no questions. So if anyone has a question, then now is the time to ask in the chat or out loud. Everyone says it's a very interesting presentation, Freek.
Yes, but now you have to ask a question because
Stephen asks if you could say more about the European platform and the relation to the local level.
Yes, well, the cooperation platform on homelessness is an idea that has been, or an initiative that has been announced by Commissioner Schmidt in an opinion article that he wrote and published in the press already in June last year, together with the Portuguese Minister of Social Affairs and Yves Leterme. But it's now becoming more concrete. It was an idea back then. Now the Portuguese presidency has made it a priority, Portuguese presidency of the European Union, and the platform will actually be formally launched on the 21st of June at a high-level conference in Lisbon. But tomorrow the European Commission will launch their action plan on the pillar of social rights. And as you know, there is homelessness mentioned in the pillar. And in that action plan, they will formally say that this collaboration platform will happen. So we'll get formal confirmation. It's the first time. The opinion article was just an opinion article. Now it will be formally part of the action plan on the pillar. And then the platform on homelessness will be launched on the 21st of June. What it will be, we don't know. Who will be involved, we don't know. All that is being developed, but of course, it's an absolute certainty that local authorities will be involved, simply for the reasons that I told you before, because local authorities are the main players in addressing homelessness. So there is no doubt. I don't think you have to do any lobbying to argue for the presence of local authorities. They will be there. More important is to think what is of most added value in terms of EU support. I think helping to access EU funding and EU financing opportunities is one. The learning, research, data collection. I think it's these kind of things that should be included in the activities of the platform. But it's a bit too early, sorry, at this stage to share much information simply because it is not there. The platform will be developed by the European Commission DG Employment in the months ahead.
Okay, thank you. Maybe for the people that are listening, as I said in the opening session, one of the main focuses of ROOF is also advocacy on a European level. And we want to do exactly that. We want to bring some key messages on housing first and data collection before the launch of the collaboration platform. We are working on that right now, preparing it and then discussing it with all the network partners. So you will be hearing from us because we think this is a great opportunity. We also have Braga among our network, Portuguese city, and this morning we had the national coordinator from Portugal on the strategy of homelessness. So stay tuned for that and see what we will do. We will definitely keep you updated on it. For now, I think this was a very useful class. Because often people think they know what it's all about, and then they hear the class and they think, okay, I heard some things that I thought differently or that I didn't know. I think Freek is a very gifted speaker and he brings it very clearly. So he's always available, I think, for questions, even if it's not now, but later on. He's very passionate about his case.
Yeah, and Patricia, maybe to just guarantee that, like, we will, like, at least we will stay in contact. I will stay in contact with you. If I hear about interesting developments with the collaboration platform, I will obviously inform you. And I think it would be important to hear from Roof what you think would be useful in terms of EU support. I think that would be useful for the European Commission to know, like like something from the local level, because there is often assumptions about what is useful at EU level. The European Commission has a tendency to think that it's monitoring and data collection, but there is probably other more practical stuff that is important for local authorities. So it would be useful if Roof, as an umbrella of local authorities, would actually feed that into the European Commission. I think, and I can help with that if you want.
Yes, we will definitely do that. We are working on that now to formulate key messages on Housing First and on data, but also we want to do specific suggestions to Europe of things that they can do that will benefit the locals, the cities, the local authorities. We are working on that right now and looking at all the data from the different roof cities, see what the problems they have in common, what Europe can do about it, and that's the things that we will be advocating in the upcoming months. It will be in May, June. I think that we will have everything ready for that. But the idea is just not only to say we need more monitoring, but also to say we think this could help, or this Europe could do this. Same for Housing First funding. But it's all too soon now to give more details because we're still preparing everything. We even haven't been able to discuss it properly with the whole network, but that will happen in the next months. And we are, of course, very happy to work with FEANTSA for that. So for now, I can only thank you for being here, Freek, for the great presentation. I wish you all a lovely lunch.